Hello and welcome to episode 35 of a grand tour with my great-great-granddad. My name is Ed Hill, and this is the podcast dedicated to the journals and history written by my great-great-grandfather, William Mowbray Campbell Scott, way back in the 1840s. So if you're tuning in again, thanks very much for doing so. I hope you've enjoyed what you've listened to so far. And if you're tuning in for the first time, you're doing so at a point where we've reached a significant moment in the journals and the podcast, because episode 35 is actually going to be the end of the first journal. In the last episode, I may have said, I thought there were maybe 2 or 3 more episodes to go before we got to the end of the first journal, but in fact, when it came down to it, we got there quicker than I thought. So this is the last episode of the very first journal of the 3 journals that were originally handwritten by my great-great-grandfather, William. To be honest, it comes at an end really mainly because I think he simply runs out of paper in the journals that he was writing in. The original journals are written on a sort of foolscap size, which is slightly bigger than A4 notebooks. And I think certainly in 2 of the editions, there's only about 200 pages. He writes on both sides of the paper, so he just basically runs out of room to write any more. And in fact, the next journal is entitled Recollections of Europe Concluded, and then under that it says A Voyage to the West Indies and Mexico. So as I say, in a way, this is really a kind of milestone that it's taken me nearly 2 years to get to. So it's significant from that point of view. It could be argued, why is it taking you 2 years? Which is probably a fair point, to be honest, as well. Anyway, I'll just explain a little bit more about this episode. William's travelling down the Rhine with his family after he'd been an engineer in Italy on the second oldest railway in Italy in Milan. And he'd got to the point where he'd started travelling down the Rhine with his family, and they got to a town called Bacharach. And this is where this next episode kicks off. To be honest, it's a slightly strange episode, I think. There's not so much of his own recollections of it, and I've got a feeling that this is probably because he was actually writing the journals 4 years later when he's in Mexico, looking back. And I think he's using a lot of notes. I think he's referencing a lot of reference books that might have explained things about the towns and sites of the Rhine. And I also think what was probably happening is the actual journey was happening quite fast, because once they're on this steamboat going down the Rhine, it's actually quite a fast journey. And whereas before he'd been on a horse and carriage travelling through these various places, I think he just literally probably got to the end of the Rhine journey and had made notes, and when he was rewriting these journals a few years later on, I think he just wanted to add some facts and figures and things like that. So I'll be honest, I don't think it reads as the most interesting part of his journals. And then also, weirdly, there's this element of him waxing quite lyrically about, the history and the geography of the Rhine as well. This was in a period when the Rhine was seen as a romantic river by poets such as Byron and people like that, who will be referred to in this episode, and artists like William Turner and that. So it was going through a period of being written about and romanticised about. And I think maybe William's trying to tap into that in some way himself. He gets a bit poetic. He claims not to have literary ambitions, but sometimes he does write in a way as if he does. And I think the sort of extracts that are here in this episode demonstrate that. So before we carry on with this last episode of the first journal, I'll just say a quick few things, as I normally do, about if you want to make contact with me. You can do so on X or Twitter, and that's Scott of the Historic at 3G Grand Tour. There's a Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. There's a Mastodon account, which is GG Grand Tour at scotted@universidon.com. And there's an Instagram site, which I'm still working on at the moment, which is Ed's 3G Tour. Those are all ways that you can contact me if you wish. And it's great to hear any feedback at all about the podcast, or be advised on any history that I may have got wrong. As I say, the next episode begins with the family carrying on their journey down the Rhine. And as usual, I'll read a bit from the journals, then stop to explain some of the things that have been referenced by William. because they do need some explanation, and then I'll carry on reading the journal again till the end. So I hope you enjoy it. Leaving Bacharach, the beautiful island of Wert on the one side and the castle of Starleck on the other keep the eye and the imagination in full play. The river again assumes the appearance of a still lake, no signs of an outlet appearing. Precipitous rocks on all sides, such are its windings and the ever-changing nature of its scenery. Beyond this spot, in the middle of the stream itself, stands the large and lonely castle of Pfalzgrafenstein, memorable for many years as a prison for the most distinguished criminals under the German Empire, and I certainly think no place could have been chosen to make the prisoner feel the loss of liberty more than this. The vine-clad hills of the shore, the cottages of the peasants, the distant spires, and the river itself swarming with a busy population, whilst they pent, so pent is just another word for confined, whilst they pent within the massive walls, only beheld the freedom and happiness of others and the rich bounties of nature they were debarred from enjoying. Next we encountered the busy town of Kaup, and above it the castle of Gutenfels, then Oberweisel, another of the once imperial towns, and behind it is situated the remains of the castle of the illustrious family of Schönberg, the ancestor of William III of England. So this Schönberg was actually a general in William of Orange's army, and he was killed at the Battle of the Boyne. All these sights were quickly passed, and then on the right arose the enormous rock Lorelei, a huge and shapeless mass, the fearful whirlpool of the bank, and the narrow defile of the Gevier, once a very dangerous place, but thanks to the march of science and the power of steam, they are so no longer. At this period of our voyage, one of those sudden storms common to the Rhine overtook us, even at that early season of the year. The thunder pealed, and the lightning flashed. The rain also descended in torrents. Sublime was the sight, and awfully grand. High above rose the vast dismantled ruins of Rheinfeld's castle, the lightning darting through its shattered casements and broken arches, and brightening up the gloomy trees that here and there clothed the rocks. And tossed to the angry winds, the water-birds wheeled swift over the river, uttering harsh and discordant screams. Yes, a storm upon the Rhine has a grandeur it is impossible to paint. The feudal ruins that everywhere rise from the lofty heights, speaking in characters of stern decay, of many a former battle against time and tempest. The broad and rapid course of the legendary river all harmonise with the elementary strife, and you feel at once that to see the Rhine only in the sunshine is to be unconscious of its most magnificent aspects. What baronial wars have those venerable ruins witnessed? From the rapine of those lordly tyrants that once owned the ancient battlements rose that great bulwark of liberty of the Middle Ages, the first confederation of the Rhine. The great strife between new and old, the town and castle, the citizen and the feudal chief. Grey and stern, how many ages have these ruins breasted the storm? We next gazed upon the ruins of Thurmberg, or Berg Mouse Castle, surrounded by rich gardens that descend to the river's brink, and the quiet village sequestered beneath the rocks, with its neat whitewashed cottages. And now the spires of Coblentz rose upon the sight, backed by many a hill sloping away to the horizon. High, dark and massive, on the opposite bank swelled the towers and rock of Ehrenbreitstein, a type of fortress to that great chivalric spirit. The honour that the rock claims for itself, which has held so many sacrifices of blood and treasure, but which ever creates in the mind of man a far deeper interest than the more peaceful scenes of life by which it is contrasted. There, still from the calm waters and the abodes of common toil and ordinary pleasure, we turn our aspiring gaze, and as we stare on that lofty and immemorial stronghold, we recall to mind the famine and the sieges, and we are compelled to concede that the more daring crimes of our fellow men have a strange honour in making holy the very spot they have assisted to devastate. Such is what statesmen call glory and soldiers call honour, to me false and idle names. This important fortress is seated on an immense rock directly opposite Koblenz, on the right bank of the river Rhine, and in the former archbishopric of Treves, or the Diocese of Trier. The French blockaded it in 1798 and in 1799 during the negotiations for peace, till at length it was obliged to surrender for want of provisions on January the 29th. A year later, in 1801, it was blown up. At the bottom of the rock, below the fortress, and near the little town of Thal Ehrenbreitstein, is a castle of the Elector, which was also in great part destroyed during the siege. However, in 1802, the great dilapidated fortress above the village, and the jurisdiction appertaining to it, were bestowed upon the Prince of Nassau-Weilburg by way of compensation. They were subsequently ceded to Prussia, and now belong to the Prussian Grand Duchy of the Lower Rhine. Since then, the fortress has been lately rebuilt on the newest and most approved principles, so that it is now considered one of the finest fortresses in the world. Right, I'm going to stop at this point to talk about a few things and features that William has discussed on his journey so far. The first thing I thought I'd mention, because as you can imagine, in this stretch of the Rhine, there are lots and lots of castles that were owned or originally built by these various dukes and electors and archbishops who all had rule over various stretches of the river. So I'm certainly not going to go through all of them because there's far too many, but I'm going to pick out a few of note. And the first one of these is this castle, Grafenstein. And this was built in the river itself on a sort of shallow stretch of the river, midstream. And it's quite a distinctive looking building. I think the reason I chose it is because it almost looks like a sort of battleship in the middle of the Rhine. It's got this tall tower in the middle and then these various things projecting from the walls of it that almost look like guns. But it was built actually in a shape to also break ice that formed on the river as well. So it's got this almost like a pointed bow thing looking at it as well. But it was originally built in 1326 by King Ludwig of Bavaria. And it was like a lot of these fortifications. It was used to get tolls on the river. And in this case, they used to run a chain from the castle to the river bank. And they would lift it when they wanted to stop vessels passing through and lower it once they paid the toll. And if they didn't pay the toll, the poor crew would get accosted or kidnapped, I suppose, and apprehended and would be put in a dungeon in this castle. And interestingly, it says the dungeon actually consisted of a floating raft, so they were stuck on this floating raft in the dungeon, as I suppose the river rose and lowered. But anyway, it was all just a way of making money, basically, and there's a lot of rivalry amongst all these various lords, archbishops, electors, and people in that area at the time to try and get money off the poor people trying to just trade along the river. And I suppose this one was a particularly handy location, being midstream. On one side, boats couldn't navigate anyway because a little bit further down the stream it got very dangerous for vessels anyway, so they were kind of forced to have to go one side of the castle anyway. At its height, it had about 20 to 50 men in it, stopping vessels passing by. A bit later, larger walls were added so guns could be put in place. But it's quite a distinctive castle. They've painted it in what they think were the original colours that it would have been painted in. And it's got this pink and white combination. And rather like what I discussed in the previous episode, the Mouse Tower, this was just yet another one of these structures, fortifications, castles, whatever you want to call them, that was built on the River Rhine, and now, of course, look all sort of very picturesque and belie their somewhat more sinister reason for being built in the first place. That was usually at the expense of some poor crew on a boat or traders. Apparently, they didn't stop collecting tolls here until 1867, so when Will was travelling, I suppose his steamship at some point stopped, or they came to an arrangement that they paid a toll, I don't know. In this country, we have the Dartford crossing charge, where you pay online, and it allows you a number of journeys to go over the bridge or through the tunnel. I don't know what the medieval equivalent of being able to pay your toll online would be. Maybe they threw a pigeon at the walls as they were going past, I don't know, with the required cash strapped to its poor legs. Maybe they just wrapped it around a rock and lobbed it at them, I don't know. Anyway, I suppose if they were paying in gold, it would be quite heavy for the poor pigeon to take off and fly over. I don't know, I'm musing now that pigeons were used to pay tolls. I'm sure there was some easier way of doing it without the internet in 1326. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is not the castle, but it's this hill or mountain that William describes called Lorelei. And this quite dramatic looking mountain right on the river's edge is a geological landmark that has many myths associated with it. I think part of the problem is on this stretch of the Rhine, it was also quite a common location where, for whatever reasons, probably to do with the current and the riverbanks and riverbed and so forth, where accidents tended to happen and boats sank. And so I suppose that also kind of helped with the myths that built up around this mountain or rock called Lorelei. And there's this suggestion that as you go past the rock, there's a kind of murmuring sound. So this was the reason various myths and rumours started to be told about this rock. You know, there was tales that dwarves lived in caves in the rock, and then there was a tale that a woman called Lorelei, who had basically seduced a nobleman and was being taken to be imprisoned, went up the Lorelei to have one last look at the Rhine and fell to her death. And then this evolved into a story that there was a kind of siren character, an attractive woman, mermaid type figure with golden hair, who would be seated on the Lorelei Rock, combing her golden hair, singing and distracting poor seamen as they went round the Rhine and making them crash into the rocks. I mean, this tale of sirens and sailors, let's face it, it doesn't take very much to distract these navigators, does it really? I mean, the Rhine, it's not exactly the Pacific Ocean. So if you can't steer your way around the route of the Rhine, really, it doesn't say much, I've got to say, for your seamanship. But anyway, you know, if there's a pretty woman involved, who knows? Anyway, this folklore tale is being passed down the generations. And actually, the story of the siren isn't as old as it sounds. You know, it's actually something that sort of 19th century poets developed out of the kind of previous myths. But anyway, it's kind of now thought of as a German folklore thing. Anyway, it's an interesting geological form. I think it might be in some way volcanic, this, or it says, I think it calls it a slate rock. I don't quite know if that's volcanic or not. Anyway, I mean, it's obviously the stretch of the river is still quite dangerous, and as recently as 2011, a barge full of sulfuric acid actually capsized on this stretch and bend of the river and blocked the Rhine for several weeks, I think. I mock, but it obviously is a bit of a dodgy area with the various currents. But as William says in his writing, you know, he says this previously was a dangerous place, but in the age of steam, that is no longer the case. You know, and I think that refers back to what I was saying earlier on. In the age of steam, what a huge difference that must have meant to navigating up and down the Rhine and making it a useful trade route, because up until then, going downstream wasn't too bad, but going upstream was very difficult. And in fact, I saw an etching where horses are being used to pull barges upstream on the Rhine before the age of paddle steamers. So William calls steam man's mightiest agent, and, you know, it was definitely revolutionary in that sense. So the last structure that I thought I'd talk about in this section is the fortress of Ehrenbreitstein, which is near Koblenz, which William mentions. Now, the fortress that William would have been looking at that time was fairly new, because it was finished in 1826, and I think it wasn't fully operational until about 1836, so it would have been quite a modern military structure when he was going past it. It's in a significant location because Koblenz is where the Rhine and the Moselle River come together. So Koblenz is sort of on the peninsula where those two rivers meet, and Ehrenbreitstein Hill sort of overlooks Koblenz. So there'd always been fortifications there down the years, and the previous one that had been destroyed by the French in about 1800 when they'd been occupying that area. So this new fortress that was said to be the largest in Europe, apart from Gibraltar, I suppose, I mean the whole area of Gibraltar. Anyway, this was said to be the largest fortress in Europe, and it was actually one of three, I think, in that area in various hillsides overlooking Koblenz that the Prussians, who were then in charge of Koblenz, built to protect it from invasion. And Ehrenbreitstein itself is the tallest point or hill at this point in the Rhine. So it's a pretty impregnable fortification. Once it was built, it was never really attacked or taken over successfully by anyone. And it was a place used during the First World War as a military headquarters. In the Second World War, the Germans actually used it as a place to store archives and precious cultural objects. These days, I think you can get a cable car from Koblenz to it. I think it goes over the Rhine. And it's a youth hostel and a museum with several museums in it. I think one's about, obviously, military history. I think there's one about the wine trade in that area as well. But it's a very big fortification that would have been finished just a few years before William would have been passing by on the steamship below. As is often the case in these situations, William Turner had actually painted a scene of Ehrenbreitstein, although in this one it's sort of in the background, so you can't really see the fort in all its glory. It's in a kind of typical Turner-esque misty haze in the background with what looks like Germanic peasant figures in the foreground. William Turner's picture was in 1835, so about 8 years before William's time. So perhaps it was still being built. But there we are, Ehrenbreitstein, which I think translated into English is the broad stone of honour. So yeah, it's obviously one of those German compounded words, Ehrenbreitstein, the broad stone of honour. Bit of a long name for it as well. Apparently the Turner painting would be worth between 15 million and 25 million pounds these days. I can't say it's one of his best. Koblenz is situated in the Prussian states and is the capital of the Grand Duchy of the Lower Rhine. It is delightfully situated on the confluence of the Rhine and Moselle, opposite to the fortress of Ehrenbreitstein. The city is large and well built. The most remarkable edifice is the magnificent palace built in 1779 for the residence of the electors of Treves, generally known as Trier these days. It has 2 handsome quays on the Moselle and the Rhine, which are used for public promenades. The situation of this city is highly favourable for trade, as it has direct communication with parts of France by the Moselle, and with Germany, Switzerland and Holland by the Rhine. An aqueduct constructed by the last elector brings the finest water from the height near Metternich over the Moselle Bridge into all quarters of the city. The chief articles of commerce are the Moselle and also French wines. About 1 mile from the city is a building formerly a Carthusian monastery, which is well worth the attention of travellers on account of the view which it affords of the 2 rivers on which the city stands. This building is now changed into a fort called Hunenkopf. These days that's Fort Constantin. On the other side of the Moselle, Fort Francis is situated. So this is called Fortress Emperor Franz. These are all changed names at the time, so William's using, obviously, names that he was given at that time, but many of them have changed in some sort of way. And as I mentioned earlier, these fortifications were all part of a more general system called the Festung Koblenz, or Koblenz Fortress, which consisted of several fortifications around Koblenz, including Ehrenbreitstein. These 2 forts protect the city on the land side. On the left bank of the Rhine, and at the time of my visit, they were adding fortifications. These works, with those of the strong fortress of Ehrenbreitstein, will render Koblenz one of the strongest fortresses and a very important defence to Germany, particularly the Prussian monarchy. The confluence of the 2 rivers has always given Koblenz great military importance, even in the time of the Romans, who built a strong camp here. On the road from Koblenz to Cologne is the monument to General Marceau. So this was François-Séverin Marceau, mentioned by Lord Byron in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Population 13,500. But man's mightiest agent is again at work. The steamer is passing her rapid course down the stream. The storm has long since passed away, and though only the month of March, the sun is shining, serene and warm. Broad and straight flows the noble river on this part of its career. On one side lay the wooded village of Namedy, the hamlet of Fornich, backed by the blue rock of the Crisborne Lea. Not quite sure I've been able to find exactly what he means by this reference here, but Fornich was a little fishing village on the banks of the Rhine, and there are mountains that stretch behind it. The mountains that shade the mysterious Brawl, and on the opposite shore you see the mighty rock of Hammerstein. So there's also a castle here, Hammerstein Castle, with green and livid ruins sleeping on its summit. Two towers rise haughtily above the more dismantled wrecks. How changed since the alternate banners of the Spaniard and then the Swede waved from their ramparts in that great war in which the gorgeous Wallenstein won his laurels. So this is Albrecht von Wallenstein, who was a general during the 30 Years' War in the 1600s. Still in its mighty calm yet flows the ancestral Rhine, and our vessel reflected the sight with her long smoky pennant on its now smooth expanse, and above, girded by thin and shadowy clouds, the sun casting his rays upon rocks covered with verdure, whilst far off were seen the twin spires of the old town of Andernach, tranquil in the distance. Andernach, this town which is the Roman Antonacum, appears to have been even in the 4th century a place of great importance. It was one of the 7 Rhine cities taken by Julian in his campaign against the Germans in 359. It appears to have been the seat of a military prefect, and with Cologne and Koblenz was the second of the chief Roman stations on the Gallic shore. After the expulsion of the Romans under Harabanus, it came into the possession of the Franks, whose kings are said to have had a palace here, from the windows of which they fished in the stream below. The ruins of this palace are still visible on the southeast side of the town, and from this situation it appears highly probable that the Rhine has altered its bed since their erection. The last king who resided in the palace was Sigbert in 1417. I haven't been able to find a reference to him, old Sigbert. The Emperor Frederick granted several privileges to the town on account of their faithful services in the war against Burgundy, and in May 1688 the French laid the greater part of the town in ashes. Its present state is flourishing on account of the exportation of millstones and tuff and trap, 2 articles which are prepared into excellent cement, which withstands completely the action of water. Yeah, so tuff is a volcanic rock that's used in the making of cement. So this was an area where there was a large amount of it, and it was exported far and wide from this area of the Rhine. The town possesses many relics of antiquity, some remains of the original Roman wall, and a circular tower standing on the bank of the Rhine, also of Roman origin. But it bears the marks of workmanship of a later age in its interior, which contains a fine groined roof, with ornaments that are generally attributed to the 10th or 12th century. In the garden of an inn in the town is placed a Roman altar, in good preservation, erected by Domitius Rufuncus. Okay, I'm going to break in here just to talk about a couple of things that Williams mentioned in this previous section. The first thing I just thought I'd mention is this reference to Byron that he makes and his poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. So the long narrative poem that made Byron's name, really, it was his big success. And once it was published, and I think it was in about 1815, I might have to look that up, it was sort of almost an instant hit overnight. And it's really this story of a young man wandering throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, observing what he sees and reflecting on it and revealing his feelings and emotions. The term child is spelt with an E on the end, and it's a specific reference to a chivalric term for a nobleman who was about to become a knight but hadn't yet. So a precursor to a knight, or a junior knight, a provisional knight, a provisional driving licence. I don't know. No, anyway, the thing about this poem, I don't want to go too much into the detail of it, because if you look it up, you'll find all sorts of things. It was very, very influential. It also influenced not only other writers and poets, but also musicians. Liszt and Beethoven wrote pieces that were influenced by it. But the character of Childe Harold himself is this sort of melancholy young man wandering the world, reflecting on his unhappy past, perhaps unrequited loves or requited loves, and observing things like bullfighting in Spain and reflecting on the imagery of it and slavery in Greece and all these sort of things. Basically, it's the kind of Byronic hero. So when we think of Byron and his kind of romantic image that he has, you could virtually say Childe Harold and Byron were essentially the sort of same person. But obviously Byron used this Childe Harold as I think the word someone used was avatar of himself to reveal his feelings about the world. And so it's really the start of the whole Byron romantic hero phenomenon, really. And there's 3 sections of it. The first section, he goes to Spain and Portugal, and the second section is when he goes to the ancient world of Greece and the Mediterranean. And coming back, he comes through the Rhine and through Switzerland and Germany. And this is where he makes reference to this part of the Rhine in the poem. So that's why William refers to it. So, yeah, if you want to look up where the whole Byronic hero genre started, then Google Childe with an E, Harold's Pilgrimage, and you can read the poem, I suppose, if you wanted to. It's funny because there's an extract from it of this bit of the Rhine. I might dig it out and read it, but I got to say, I suppose because it's a narrative poem, some of it's not that great, and I criticise William's poetry sometimes, but there are some very good bits in it. There's a bit where Byron addresses the sea, which is very famous, which is a very nice extract, but the bit that's referred to here in this bit of the Rhine, it's not that great, and to be honest, I think some of William's poetry is on a par, shall we say. Shall we say William's poetry is on a par with Lord Byron's below par poetry? I think that's a fair assessment. But yeah, look up Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. This is the particular extract relating to this bit of the Rhine. Here, Ehrenbreitstein with her shattered wall, black with the miner's blast upon her height, yet shows of what she was when shell and ball, rebounding idly on her strength did light. A tower of victory, from whence the flight of baffled foes was watched along the plain, but peace destroyed what war could never blight, and laid those proud roofs bare to summer's rain, on which the iron shower for years had poured in vain. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about was, just briefly, the town of Andernach. So when William was travelling in this area, it would have appeared, as it does today, quite an old town, a medieval town. And there's some original Roman fortifications left, as William mentions, but mainly these days you can see medieval walls. And William mentions this thing called the Tower and says it's of Roman origin. I don't think it is. It's called the Round Tower or Rundeturm, and it was a medieval tower that was built in Andernach in 1453. It's pretty tall for that era because it's about 56 metres high, so that's about 183 feet. And it was used as a watchtower on its location because you could look a great distance down stretches of the Rhine in either direction. So obviously it was a good fortification to give you early warning of marauding enemies either coming up or down the Rhine and from other surrounding areas. So the town's quite famous for this Rundeturm. I think it's on the coat of arms and stuff like that. And another curious or very historical feature, a little bit further or on the outskirts of the town, but it's still on the river, there's what's referred to as the old crane. And this is a very, very ancient man-powered crane that was in operation for nearly 350 years. So it was built in 1561 and finished operating in 1911, but it was, and it's still there. It's a circular building, not very tall, and it has an arm coming out of the roof of it. Obviously, that's the crane bit. But it was, as I say, man-powered with a tread wheel, and inside there's a big tread wheel where 4 men would have stood and stepped on the tread wheel to raise or lower the crane. And one of the things that it loaded and unloaded on barges on the Rhine was tuff, which was the material that was used for making cement, stone material. Wine barrels, obviously, millstones, those sort of things. And it's kind of odd because one of the reasons it may have survived so long is it's actually got a stone circular structure, but the whole thing can turn. So I don't quite know how the mechanism works. Apparently 4 people were needed to turn it, either in one direction or the other, and then 4 people were needed inside it to operate the tread wheels. Now, William doesn't mention this old crane, but I suppose to him it would have just been like a thing that he saw by the side of the river that just looked like a crane being operated, which it would have been. Last thing about Andernach, and it's not really of any particular relevance to William's time there, because this phenomenon happened after his time, but it's actually the site of the world's tallest, what they call cold water geyser. I've got to say, I hadn't really heard of one of these before, but it's a geyser. Obviously, the water shoots up into the air, but it's a cold water one, and these are usually not related to some sort of volcanic phenomenon nearby, which is the case with hot water geysers. Cold water geysers are usually created by some sort of spurt of water and carbon dioxide. Anyway, apparently I think again in 1911, they drilled a borehole into the aquifer near Andernach, and the rock is permeated with carbon dioxide anyway, and this geyser phenomenon happens every so often, where a huge 210-foot high geyser happens. Over the years, it's sort of been switched on and off, I think, by the local authorities. But at the moment, it's a tourist attraction and you can go and see it, and it operates during the day. I've got to say, I don't really still quite understand the physics of it, to be honest. But anyway, as you go along the Rhine, you'll see this geyser shooting up into the air from time to time as you pass Andernach. But as I say, William wouldn't have seen that because it didn't exist until 1911. On leaving Andernach, the scene is changed. The stratum of the rocks and earth is black and pitchy. The springs that flow from them are of a dark and gravelliant nature. So, gravelliant is just another word for smelly, really. Tradition says that here a volcano has exhausted its fires. Here the stream of Brollbach falls into the Rhine, and near its mouth is a valley rich with oak and pine trees, and full of caverns. Here stands the castle of Schwanenberg. This valley, in former times, was the favourite and special haunt of the bold robbers of the Rhine, and from amongst the entangled brakes, so that's another word for sort of thickets or grass, that then covered the rugged cliffs, they rushed upon their prey. Next come the ruins of Oakenfels, and here the pastoral Gunbach pours its tributary waters into the noble Rhine. On, and the spars of Unkel rise in a curve of the banks. The river widens like a broad lake. Villages are seated over the extensive plain on the right, and on the left is the Isle of Worth, also known as Kemperwerth, and the houses of Oberwinter. Here the hills are covered with vines to their summit. And now breaks upon the eye the celebrated Seven Mountains, and the castle crag of Drachenfels, towering above them all. And by the shore you see from place to place the islands stretching their green lengths along the river and breaking the exalting tide. Village rises upon village, and viewed from the distance as you sail, all that might enamour us of a village life crowds thick and fast upon the mind. Leaping into the broad basin of the Rhine comes many a stream and rivulet on either side. Spire upon spire rises and sinks as you sail on, mountain and city, the solitary island, the castle steep, like the dreams of ambition, proudly swell, suddenly appear, and then dimly fade away. Such is the mighty Rhine, an emblem of luxuriance, fertility, and romance. The fearful gloom of the Harz, the feudal towers, the gigantic remains of antique power, profusely scattered over plain, mountain, and forest. The thousand mixed recollections that hallow the ground, the stately Roman, the stalwart Goth, the chivalry of the feudal age, and the dim brotherhood of the ideal world have here alike recorded their remembrance. As the Rhine flows, so flows the mind of the contemplative traveller that gazes on its scenes. By mountain and valley, the wildest solitude, the spires of ancient cities, the mouldering castle, the stately monastery, the humble cot, grandeur and homeliness, history and superstition, truth and fable, succeeding one another so as to blend into a whole. Okay, I thought I'd just stop here just to mention a couple of things at this point that Williams discussed. The first one is he makes this reference to the robbers of the Rhine. As I've discussed before, up and down the Rhine there were various castles charging tolls along the river as a way of gathering taxes. Now, this was generally done under the auspice of the Holy Roman Empire, so the archbishops and lords and so forth who were doing this were doing it with the permission of the Holy Roman Empire, and no doubt probably contributing some money to the empire as well. But amongst them were these unregulated barons and robbers, and so they became known as the robber barons, and they operated outside of the Holy Roman Empire. The German word for them is Raubritter, or robber knight, and basically they charged even more excessive tolls than what had been agreed amongst the other interested parties, or to use a modern word, stakeholders. And they were quite ruthless as well. You know, they would steal ships, they would steal cargoes, they would kidnap people who were crews on the boats. And there was a particular period where they flourished called the Great Interregnum, where the rule of the Holy Roman Empire on the Rhine was not as strong as it could have been. So over this 25-year period, loads and loads of these robber barons sprung up and built castles and charged excessive tolls, and as I say, they weren't averse to kidnap and ransom and all sorts of dubious goings on. They were eventually clamped down on when the Holy Roman Empire got its act together, and the other dukes and archbishops of the area came together to put them down, and some of them were hanged and so forth and made examples of. So eventually they got their comeuppance for operating outside the law, I suppose, or outside of the conventions of what had been agreed, because apparently these tolls averaged about every 5 kilometres down the Rhine, and they generally had been a kind of agreed amount of what the tolls should be, but these robber barons charged more, and if they didn't get their money, then they might get your ship or your person and hold you for ransom. The next thing I thought I'd mention is the Seven Hills, which are a kind of volcanic geological area of this part of the Rhine, going back from the edge of the Rhine into the distance. And there's 7 hills that are well known, and they're known as in German, Siebengebirge, or the 7 Hills. But the most famous one is a hill that William references, Drachenfels, or Dragon Rock. And this one is right on the edge of the Rhine, and there was a castle that was at the very top of it, and it's in ruins now. I think there's not much of it left at all now. In William's time, there would have been a bit more of it noticeable, but it would have been in ruins in William's time as well. But it's quite a high point in the Rhine, and there's quite a few myths about this mountain as well, hence its name. Probably the main one is that it's named after a dragon that resided there, called Fafnir. And in the story of the Nibelungenlied and all those Wagnerian tales, or Nordic tales that Wagner wrote about that inspired his music, Siegfried kills this dragon and then he bathes in his blood, and that gives him invincibility. So that's the main myth surrounding this mountain. It's also the first big hill that, as you're travelling up the Rhine, you come to. So it's also sometimes jokingly called the highest hill in Holland, because when Dutch tourists make their way to the Rhine, they always go up Drachenfels. And over the years, it's become quite a tourist spot. And even in the 19th century, a sort of chain railway was built so people could get up to the top of it, a bit like Snowdon in this country in Wales. There's a railway going up to the top of it. And I think there's now a restaurant there as well and everything. But anyway, it became known in myth because of this story about Siegfried. And I think there's also another myth about some Christian woman being attacked by a dragon there and showing it her crucifix, and the dragon immediately turns and dives into the Rhine and is never seen again. So that was another tale about it, but it's a kind of Game of Thrones type mountain. It's volcanic, but it wasn't a volcano. It was kind of like a bulge. The magma bulged up, but it never erupted into a volcano, so that's what created this hill of Drachenfels. After passing Drachenfels, the river flows through a flat and uninteresting country as regards scenery, but at the same time a thickly populated one. At some distance further, the steamer brought up alongside the quay of the city of Bonn, which is the capital of the Prussian government of Cologne, and formerly the residence of the Elector of Cologne. It is situated on the left bank of the Rhine. The city was formerly fortified, but the works were demolished in 1717. A lyceum was instituted here in 1802, an academy had been established in 1717, and in 1786 raised into a university. This institution was superseded by the lyceum. The manufacturers here are not important. The commerce is chiefly carried out amongst Jews, of which there are 200 in the city who dwell in a particular street. A walk with 4 rows of trees and 1,200 paces in length leads to the beautiful palace of Clemensrucha, near the village of Poppelsdorf. Bonn contains the University of the Rhine, the charter of which was given in October the 18th, 1818 in Aix-la-Chapelle by the King of Prussia, who at the same time endowed it with an annual income of 80,000 Prussian dollars, 16,000 of which are appropriated to the Botanical Garden. This, once the former residence of the Elector of Cologne, was bestowed upon the university, and it has been fitted up at great expense, and is surpassed in extent and beauty by no university buildings in Europe. It contains all the lecture halls, a library of more than 50,000 volumes, a museum of antiquities, a collection of casts of the principal ancient statues, a cabinet of natural philosophy, clinical institutions of uncommon extent and order, to which may be added a Catholic theological seminary and a refectory. The paintings in the Aula Minor, so that's like a small hall really, a small lecture hall, amongst others the great allegorical picture, The Christian Church, were executed by some pupils of Cornelius. So I think this is an artist called Cornelius Johnson, who was around in the 15 and 1600s, and actually most of his career was doing portraits. And he was Dutch, but born in England, and he spent most of his early part of his career doing paintings and portraits of English aristocrats. But later on in life he did move to Utrecht, which isn't far from here, so perhaps that's why the pupils started being inspired by his work and were instructed by him. I don't know, they were his pupils anyway. I can't find an actual reference to this particular picture called The Christian Church. As you can imagine, that's quite a hard one to search on the web and find a specific image. Thanks to the liberality of the king, the university owes also an anatomical hall, a new riding school, and an edifice, once a royal palace in Poppelsdorf, 10 minutes' walk from the city, which contains the mineralogical and zoological collections, and before it lays a botanical garden. Adjoining it are the lands and buildings for the use of the Agricultural Institute. The Cathedral of Bonn is one of the most celebrated for its architectural beauty in the Prussian dominions, and not without good reason, for it certainly is a most splendid specimen of the Gothic style, more especially in the interior, which also contains fine monuments of some celebrated men. Bonn contains 5 other churches, 1 Protestant and 4 Catholic ones. The tower of the old custom house, which commands a fine view, has been converted into an observatory. The king has also established here a printing press for Sanskrit, which was originally placed under the inspection of A.W. von Schlegel. So this is August Wilhelm Schlegel, a famous writer and academic. The Museum of German and Roman Antiquities is under the direction of the same distinguished scholar. The teachers of the 5 faculties, of which the university consists, are more than 50. Particular advantages are afforded for the education of young men intended for instructors. Many men distinguished in various branches of science are connected with the university. The exertions in Bonn, all the means of instruction, united with the charms of the place and the beauties of the scenery, have made the university in short time very much frequented. Bonn has a population of 12,600. Okay, this is the last section of the journal I'm going to talk about in this episode. The first thing that I'm going to mention is just this quick reference that William makes to the Jewish population being the main instigators of commerce in Bonn. I'll just very quickly say that at this time, when William says they lived in a street in Bonn, That was kind of literally true. There was a single street in Bonn where most, not all, but nearly all of the Jewish residents of Bonn lived, and at times, sometimes that was a gated street as well, when times were not so sympathetic to Jewish people in Germany. Unfortunately, if you look back at the history of the treatment of Jewish people in Germany, I mean, of course, around the whole of Europe, it's not good. Actually, one of the more enlightened times was under Napoleon's leadership, because in the French Empire, he made Jewish people equal citizens to everybody else. But, of course, when his reign finished, some of those old traditional, unfortunately, anti-Jewish laws and customs reasserted themselves. And at William's time, as I say, the Jewish population in Bonn literally probably were living in a single street, despite probably being the driving force behind its commercial activities. The next thing I'm going to mention is this University of Bonn that William describes, which was the former electoral palace. And it is this very large building, very grand, built in 1697 by Joseph Clemens of Bavaria, who was the elector of the area at that time. The elector just means the ruler, basically, is another word for ruler of that area. And he had this massive palace built. But in 1818, it became the University of Bonn. And since then, that's been its history. And as William notes, near it, and to some degree still existing today, there's this very long walkway of chestnut trees, a tree-lined avenue that links what was the electoral palace, the University of Bonn, to this other palace about a kilometre away called the Poppelsdorf Palace, which was a Baroque palace that was built a little bit later by another electoral, also called Joseph Clemens, and he was the Archbishop elector, so he was an Archbishop as well as elector of Cologne, and he had it built anyway. They're now both university buildings. So you do have this very grand walkway that links these two buildings. Some of it has been built on since William's time, but the majority of it is still there if you want to walk. It's about a kilometre, I think, from the Poppelsdorf Palace to the Electoral Palace, or vice versa. And the University of Bonn itself was established in 1818. It's one of Germany's top universities, and I think it's had many, many Nobel laureates have been ex-students, and I think very well-known alumni as well. I think Karl Marx studied there, Thomas Mann studied there, Friedrich Nietzsche studied there. So, it's got a very big roll call of well-known, influential academic dudes. And one of those is the last person I was going to mention is William Schlegel, August Wilhelm Schlegel, who William describes as being involved in studying Sanskrit at the university at the time he was there. And basically, Schlegel was very well known primarily for his translations of Shakespeare into German, which became very popular and are still cited as very, very good translations of Shakespeare's plays, and subsequently making Shakespeare popular in Germany too. But Schlegel himself, is a lifelong academic and also poet, but particularly interested in Indo-European languages. There's a particular word they call it, Indologist. So basically that's a study of Indian languages, Indo-European languages. So he was very interested in this whole idea of the roots of language and how it developed from its Indian roots into Europe. But as I say, he's probably best known for his translations of Shakespeare. Sein oder nicht sein. Right, so this is where I'm going to conclude this episode. As I said at the beginning, the final extract from the first journal. And we got to episode 35, which is quite sort of a round number, isn't it? Quite suitable. And also another factor is this will be the last episode that's automatically uploaded to YouTube. For some reason, Acast, to do with commercial opportunities or something like that. Acast, who host this podcast, won't be doing that anymore, which actually, to be honest, I don't get many listeners through YouTube, and it's a bit of a strange experience just watching an audio file, really. So I don't think it's a significant dent in the listening figures, but it was just nice that it was kind of automatically done. I do have a YouTube channel where it's on, and I do intend to put some more visual material into that. But it's a nice point to finish. I hope you have enjoyed this first journal. I've perhaps read it more thoroughly and talked about it more thoroughly than I initially anticipated, I have to say, than when I first started doing this project. So I apologise if episodes have been a bit overlong and have helped you drift off to sleep. If anything, it's a good podcast for doing that. But in a way, it's quite nice to get a verbal account of nearly all the words from the journals out there in the online world. For posterity, maybe, I don't know. But as I've often said, sometimes it was hard to choose which bits to talk about and which bits to include. And that's purely been an arbitrary choice on my part. But I hope you've enjoyed the selections and things that I've made. And I have, when I could, omitted the bits of the journal where William's writing becomes a bit repetitive and stuff. So, as I say, it's a significant landmark for the journal. Now, at the end of this journal, there's a little extract. I just thought I'd read it now, because it just gives you an idea of when the journals were written and how they were written. And it says, end of Volume 1, Zacatecas, April 17th, 1844. So that's at the end of everything that William's written in this journal. And then written by my mum way back in 1948. Are some nice little words that my mum must have decided to put in there all those years ago after she'd read it. And it says, read in the year 1948 by his descendant, Valerie Caroline Scott. So that's my mum. And then I added a bit about me having read it in 2008, but I won't read that bit. So it's a nice little connection, which has also been the other personal element of this, of course, is the family connection with William that I have, and his verbose pomposity sometimes. Anyway, so as I say, the next journal begins, as I said, Recollections of Europe Concluded, and then a journey to the West Indies and Mexico is how it's described. And he's saying that commenced in October 1843, so his journey out to Mexico commences in 1843. So he was writing this account of his time in Europe, not that much later then, is it, if it's 1844? I wonder how long it took him to write it. Yeah, it's interesting, because, I mean, I'm reading it and it takes ages, let alone he's writing it. Maybe he started sort of doing it almost immediately when he got to Mexico, I suppose. Anyway, that next one begins at the city of Cologne. So they get to Cologne, they get to a hotel, and then he starts talking about his impressions of Cologne. I'm actually going to have a sort of little bit of a break just at this point from doing more of these episodes, just because I'm going to try and do some more stuff on YouTube about the journals and just finding other ways of kind of promoting it a bit more on Instagram and stuff like that, just to get it a little bit more widely known. So there'll be a bit of a break now, not a very long one, before I begin doing the second journal, which actually I think in many ways is the most interesting one, because I think it's the most first-hand written one. There's all the journey out across the Atlantic via the West Indies, and then quite a lot of travelling across Mexico to get to Zacatecas. And of course, these are all very, very different experiences for William. Obviously, he's essentially a European person, so his experiences around Europe are a bit more closer to his own life experiences. But of course, once he starts going to the West Indies and Mexico, these culturally are much more different. And so I think perhaps there's more of his personal impressions in the second journal. So yeah, that's it really. I've reached the end. You may be relieved to know of episode 35. And I do hope you have been enjoying listening to it, and I will commence the second journal fairly soon, but there will be a period where I'll be doing other YouTube stuff and other visual media stuff, I think, about the journals and about the podcast for a little while before I start doing the second journal. And please, as I said, do give me some feedback through those ways I mentioned before, through Twitter, which I don't know if Twitter's or X has got much of a future at the moment, I'm not sure. But anyway, that's a good way to contact me, and the Facebook page. Twitter is Scott of the Historic, that's at 3G Grand Tour, and the Facebook page is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. They're probably the best ways. So that is it for the last time in this particular section of the journals and the podcasts. If you have been, thanks for listening.
Bye-bye, everybody.